Welcome to Cynical Celluloid for this third and final part of the Exorcist sequel retrospective. This episode we're leaving our sanity at the door and indulging in delusion as a new broom enters the asylum to brush away our own little realities. The absurdity and contradictions of sanity come up against the liberation of madness in the largely neglected and far lesser known sequel that would be neglectfully missed off of most lists. After all, it's not even got the word Exorcist in the title. William Peter Blatty writes and directs the madness that is the Ninth Configuration. After a self-aborted space mission, astronaut Billy Cutshaw is sectioned into a military mental hospital where a change in regime is about to take place in the form of the arrival of Captain Vincent Kane. As the inmates go around making mayhem in the course of their rather eccentric theatre production, Kane allows them to indulge in their delusions and exercise their frustrations by allowing them to behave in accordance with their whims and feelings. Billy, a leader of sorts within the group, pushes the boundaries and is very confrontational, while Major Groper pushes from the other direction as the lunatics take over the asylum. Kane persists with his experimental program, which pushes the bounds of reason, all while he holds a secret not just from everyone in the asylum, but from himself. The Ninth Configuration was, at least until The Exorcist 3 came to be, considered by William Peter Blatty to be the actual sequel to the first film, The Exorcist. The most pressing thing to get out of the way is that this film is a somewhat oddball entry into the series, as it doesn't follow on from The Exorcist in anything other than the most minute way, on the face of things at least, though it does in ways that run very deep. Now, I'm going to do something a little unusual, and I'm going to take a moment to give an explicit spoiler warning, over and above my usual steps here, because I do think it's one of those films that really warrants a cold viewing, which explains my brevity with the synopsis. So I'll say it here and now. I highly recommend you see this film and come back and watch this video after you've seen the film. Just know, it's not a horror, there are no spinning heads or pea soup vomit or the likes. It's not even a scary movie. At the time of recording this video, it's available on Prime for free in the UK, and it's likely available in all sorts of other places. Go watch it, I'll see you in a couple of hours. So, now that that's taken care of, I'm assuming I'm left with those who have either seen it, or don't care about spoilers. Good. Or more fool you for allowing me to ruin the movie for you. As I've mentioned in the intro, this isn't exactly an obvious sequel. In fact, you could watch this without having seen The Exorcist at all and not realise that anything was amiss. There is one explicit link to the Exorcist film in this, and even when you know what that is, it can seem a bit tenuous, which is probably why the film wasn't marketed as being an Exorcist sequel. For those who don't know what links the stories, at least on a world's basis, I would say this. Do you remember the party scene in the original? The adults are having fun downstairs when Reagan appears and poops the party by telling a guy, "You're all going to die up there," before peeing on the carpet. The character that she says that to is astronaut Captain Billy Cutshaw, the main patient in this story. Yep, that's it for the linking of the two films, well, other than what lays beneath. And this is why, despite it being made and released after Exorcist 2 and a long time before Exorcist 3, I've left it for the last one in this series. It's such an odd fit. In contradiction to Blatty himself, I would consider this, if you forgive the pun, a spiritual sequel rather than a direct one. If I didn't make it obvious in the previous reviews, Exorcist 2 feels more like an Exorcist rip-off, though a fun one, while Exorcist 3 sits with me as the most fitting film to be described as a full sequel. The Exorcist 2 is rather like what Halloween 3 is to Halloween, at least in terms of the proverbial apples and oranges. But let's look at what the film actually is, over and above its place in a list. After a rather wistful song about San Antone, the story opens up with an aborted rocket launch, and quickly we come face to face with Captain Cutshaw himself, residing in our rather fantastical castle-come asylum. It's a rather chaotic place, with the inmates coming over like a troop of extremely eccentric corporal clingers stuck in a prison/boot camp. I did say this isn't a horror, didn't I? Into this strange situation comes an enigmatic new lead for the facility in the form of Colonel Vincent Kane, who's immediately dunked under the murky waters of questionable reality that this story exists in. Kane is a largely stoic wall of a man, barely showing emotion in any interaction, and only occasional cracks of emotion that slip through on occasions. Otherwise, there's only a wall of self-repression where any expression of emotion is by proxy through the patients being allowed to express themselves however they feel. Compare and contrast with Cutshaw in particular, a man who is deeply emotional, mostly with anger, and expressive as far as he can muster. And there's a obviously heightened world in place here, and it's only going to get cranked up over the next hour and a half. The world in which the ninth configuration takes place is an odd one, crazy one may say, and this is one of those stories that begs the question of whose world is this? And it's a trickier question than one would imagine in this case. For me, it seems occasionally unclear that this is one person's world. The story seems to jump from character to some extent, but three in particular stand out. Firstly and most obvious, Kane. There are times when we're in his head and his story dominates more often than not. Second, Cutshaw. He has the opening and closing to the movie, and his story is central to Kane's focus. And there are several scenes that are clearly his without the participation of Kane. Thirdly, Dr. Fell, who is the main character observing the proceedings and the one with the knowledge of what's going on. There are also flashes of insight from surrounding characters like Major Groper when he watches the interaction between Keynes and Fairbanks. So on this occasion, while it's very much a psychological view of the world, it's one that seems to be almost communal. It's like a dramatised biography. It's not objective, it's subjective, like it's coloured by the character mindsets. The most dominant candidate, however, is Cutshaw. Drawing from other things that were said after the fact, it feels almost like he's remembering things from his own skewed point of view and including other people's testimonies. It's not entirely straight-cut and watertight. Like Blatty's other works, I think it's fair to say he directs like a writer writes. The structure of how a story is told in a book necessitates a lot of access into various characters' minds. I think this is where the rather overt use of dialogue reveals the puppeteer pulling the strings, though this said, I don't really mind it when Blatty does this. He uses the strengths of the written form to take advantage of the characters and their insights. It's a plus because he's a great writer, even if it's not necessarily a very desirable cinematic approach. Now, not being straight cut actually describes this film's reality well, as it's a reality which is frankly bonkers. This is a film that spends the first half bordering on being a Monty Python entry. There is a patient trying to cast Shakespeare with dogs, and then other animals. There's a motley crew of comedy-level psychiatric patients who indulge in all sorts of what I can only describe as japes, stereotypical military types and oddball situations like Dr. Fell spending the first couple of scenes we get to know him sans pantaloons. And this is only scraping the surface of how strange things are here. In one scene we see a patient beg for his flying belt to be returned to him, only for him to literally fly by the main characters later to almost no remark. This is the first half of this film. It's legitimately hilarious, while the second half rapidly becomes darker in tone. In this regard, it stands as a model for Blatty's second Exorcist film, Exorcist 3, in that this uncomfortable world in which we're being lowered into is disarmingly cordial despite an air of oddness to begin with. Without it both, Exorcist 3 and this would be very, very dark places. The second half is where the artifice of this comedic world begins to crumble, and the story begins to take precedence over the narrator. Truths come to the fore, and the real world, well, the film's real world that is, intrudes upon the somewhat more comfortable delusion. The transition is shockingly seamless. In fact, this is one of those movies that demands at least 2 or 3 viewings to get the most of. As the clues are there, you just don't catch them the first time around. Groper seems to be fearful rather than respectful of Dr. Kane. Dr. Fell almost gives the game away to Kane on several occasions, and Kane's inner thoughts almost betray him to himself as well, and so on. Blatty certainly had a very complete world and purpose in the story. But it's not Kane's story, it's Cutshaw's. It's a story about a man who made a significant mark on his life. So what is the story? As I've mentioned earlier, Cutshaw is the astronaut that Reagan made a very ominous prediction to. And as he was about to launch into space, he aborts the mission, ranting,
"Nothing up there! Nothing!
As the story continues, there are many exchanges between the characters, principally between Cutshaw and Kane, that have a religious or spiritual bent. And that's where the story lies. It's about good and evil, the power of faith, the saviour and being saved, redemption of the sinful, even the origins and the nature of evil. These are the central themes to the main characters, and they're explored in the face of a failing medical and man-led authority. When Kane's true identity is revealed, we find that he's a very disturbed man, haunted by the unmistakably evil things he did. Having retreated into a delusion, he needs to find redemption in the act of healing, saving someone else instead of killing them. As we know him at this point, he's a man who certainly has faith. His musing on the ninth configuration being his creationist belief that life could not have come into being on its own, and he stands almost as an avatar for a sinful Jesus, not unlike elements of Scorsese's Jesus in The Last Temptation of Christ. Meanwhile, there's Cutshaw. He's a man who, apparently after his encounter with Reagan, lost his faith, and while he spends some of his time mocking belief in God, he seems to be skirting the boundaries of misotheism as opposed to simply being an atheist. I suspect this is a flaw of Blatty himself, and his arguments go against non-believers, treating atheism as a symptom of illness or a source of madness, a lack of rationality simply because you're supposedly angry with a god. That God, I might add, that you don't believe in, is about as disingenuous, dismissive and pathetic a stance as one can take. That's Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and Ray Comfort level crap right there. In this case, though, I'm willing to let it go for what it is, as the thrust of the story is far more about being a meditation on the power of faith from a faithful mind. It's something that Blatty wrote about quite often. It's something he was well known for, rather than it being a diatribe. For what it's worth, I consider the theological exploration to be one of the most expressive and interesting out there. In my opinion, it's best considered less of being an arguing of a point than it is an expression of one. In other words, it's not that preachy, thankfully. What it is all very personal to Blatty. It's Blatty's style that he invests a lot of himself and his belief into his works, and again, it's his skill as a writer that shines through in the film. The humour in his writing really does go a long way to not only making the story a palatable one, but it really does give the film a sense of humanity. The madness of the narrator, Cutshaw, allows for some very skewed and wild things to happen, which in the case of this story helps smooth out the bumps that a less religious audience may experience with the more theological elements, particularly in the second half of the film. Essentially, The Ninth Configuration is a movie that starts out drenched in the comfortingly fantastical world of a deluded mind, while reality increasingly pokes its nose in through the run of the film. The fantasy is always there, unless you believe the minor miracle that happens in the closing scene, of course. Kane, the killer Kane that is described as possessing a supernatural strength. The rumours of his killing many enemy combatants with his bare hands is mentioned on a few occasions, and he demonstrates this when confronting one of the patients who's been trying to take a walk through walls. The patient explains his theory, but is frustrated by failure and has taken to knocking a hole in the wall to prove his conclusion, and of course punish the wall. Kane grabs the hammer and he holds it firm and steady, prompting the patient to remark,
"Your grip is very, very strong. I think that your problem may lie in the properties of the hammer." Interesting.
Kane's ability seems ambiguous at this point. It's only really during the later scene where Kane tries to protect Cutter from the cruel and violent bikers that his legendary strength and infamous violence comes to the fore. This scene is quite something. Kane's restraint in the face of ridicule is remarkable, and it's only when he is left with no choice that he grabs the hand of the lead thug and crushes it along with the glass that he was holding. While, like I say, the story seems to be slipping from the utter madness at the beginning into reality, this scene indicates that Cutter, the narrator of this story, is still in a heightened sense of mental confusion. Kane becomes a kind of Hercules character. What we see is probably unreliable as a document of reality, so much as it's more of an emotional one. This in particular is what cements Cutter as the narrator for me. Funny enough though, it's this device of making the world so heavily influenced by a character's psychological point of view That both benefits the very heartfelt and personal story that's told, but it does open it up for the potential of dismissal, considering the person telling it is quite clearly having problems interpreting the world around them. When it comes to the back and forth between Kane and Cutter regarding faith, it doesn't for me come across as being reliable, especially when a minor miracle resolves the question of God's existence for Cutter in the final shot. Personally, I would have kept that a little more ambiguous. The story of how and why Kane goes from killer to healer and Cutter finding inspiration in that character seems more than enough to me to get the point across. But that's the choice that Blatty makes, and fair enough. As way of a bit of background, Blatty was a lifelong Catholic. His faith trilogy, The Exorcist, The Ninth Configuration, which was reworked from an earlier novel called Twinkle, Twinkle, Killer Kane, and Legion, which was filmed as Exorcist 3, are like seeing someone of faith wrestling with a question of faith. In that regard, someone approaching these works from a direction like mine really do need to give it a little bit of leeway for accepting certain assumptions that the story makes. It also provides some insight into the worldview when it's done well. That's not to say that criticism can't be made of positions taken by Blatty or his characters, but it does mean allowing them to express these as these are how they understand the world to be. In my point of view, Blatty is remarkably less preachy than he is opinionated. I mentioned a few years back in a discussion of another film that despite my own position on such matters, I'm actually fine with religiosity in films, and this is one of those films. There's an introspective aspect of Blatty's writing that keeps it from being entirely judgmental, and is much appreciated, even if he does by consequence push a few non-believers' buttons along the way. If there's any points knocked off in this film, it's really that there's just too many avenues gone down. Some arguments for the existence of God are thrown out there with very little confrontation, such as the likelihood of life coming to being. Don't get me wrong, it's actually a rather poetic moment in the film, there's no doubt about that, but it meets with no resistance from Cutter or anyone else. It's almost by dictate. There's a few nods to Vietnam, with the bikers being cartoonish and without reason in their hatred for the military, and I have to admit they're not written very well. In fact, they're barely characters at all. They're hollow, ill-defined avatars for hostility, given the confused exchanges that they have. None of this really adds anything to either argument. The nature of evil, however, stands as a significant focus of the attention of the story. The exploration of the subject infuses itself into everything from the biker gang and their hostility towards the army, to the reason that so many psychologically damaged patients exist. There are apparently several more facilities other than the one depicted in this film. And this takes us through to Kane's story. Kane is clearly an oddity from the moment he first hits the screen. He's supernaturally calm, he barely talks with any emotion, let alone anger, save for the occasional outburst or cracking of composure that happen along the story. As it happens, Kane, although acting like a man in charge, is in fact a patient. A particularly remarkable one too. Though he is mentally broken from it, he was responsible for atrocious acts of cruelty and violence, and has since completely disassociated from his true identity, taken on the role of a healer to atone for his crimes. He stands as a disturbing example of man's capacity for evil. By comparison, the bikers are nothing more than mean-spirited arseholes. He's also now a man of faith, who sacrifices himself to give an example and give hope to Cutter. So yeah, there's some weaker points to the movie which derive from the writing, but what really sticks with you is something very, very special. Like with both The Exorcist and Exorcist 3, there is a significant act of redemption. Blatty's attention to detail when writing these characters is very rewarding to see paid off, and it's even with the more peripheral of the characters, whose purpose is more often for the delivery of exposition. Even those guys feel important. The redemption of characters in Blatty's films are a heartfelt affair. It comes at a cost, and despite their failing, it's something that serves greatly to humanise them. And this is what Blatty does best. The crafting of the main cast between the acting and the writing is very engaging. Cutter, Kane and Fell are, in particular, very well defined, and the surrounding characters all contribute to the story to some extent, if not significantly, even when their time is brief. Under some very careful direction, the characters drop clue after clue as to what's going on, that only become apparent on repeat viewings. There's little glances, seemingly unwarranted reactions, slips in what turns out to be a cover story. The characters being a kind of unspoken dialogue in the movie in their own right, and through some outstanding performances, there is some very human presence in a near cartoonish reality. The central cast of three being Stacey Keach as Kane, Scott Wilson as Cutshaw, and Ed Flanders as Dr. Fell are some of the best I've seen. Kane is a stone wall of a man whose cracks begin to show throughout the movie. He surely seems to care. He's very protective of the patients and contemplative, but he's also an imposing and intimidating figure who has a dark edge that clearly scares people. Dr. Fell seems like the most tolerant and calm person you could imagine, at least for the most part. He, like Kane, shows cracks in his facade. There are nods to what his true nature is throughout the first half of the film, and he could almost be one of the loonies at times. And then there's Cutshaw. Oddly enough, in this case, his dialogue seems to be less self-serving than with others. Maybe it's part of why he doesn't always seem to be the narrator in this story. In that, he seems more provocative of Kane's character arc than a character with his own agency, by which I mean he tends to be the foil against Kane's belief. While he undoubtedly has a charming character, he does strain under the lack of the agency. His antagonism does feel specifically purposed. Again, it's where Blatty struggles with presenting the opposing stance. Such is the challenge of expressing a position of faith, I guess. You know God exists. You just say you don't. Again, it doesn't break the film. There's just a very specific kind of suspension of disbelief involved in more than one way. It helps to have this rather eccentric, skewed world that we see this here, though. Aside from the unreliable narrator, there is a particular level of oddness afforded by the location. Now bear in mind, this is supposed to be in the US. And then, behold the asylum. The rather fantastical location, actually Kassel-Elz in Germany, while the studio sets were in Budapest. It's an odd choice, but there is something afforded by this fairy tale location with its gothic overtones. It doesn't feel real, and it isn't, well, at least not in the States. Funnily enough, it seems that Blatty may have agreed with me on this one to a degree, as the film awkwardly explains why this rather exotic to the States architecture is there. The asylum itself is like a thing of legend. Cutshaw's tale itself is rather legendary with its extraordinary protagonist. The things that happen are larger than life and often bizarre. Why wouldn't this story be set in a big, scary fairy tale castle? The Ninth Configuration is a somewhat eccentric film. There's no doubt about that, but it's also an earnest one. For all the chaotic overtones of Blatty's world, there's an underlying emotional goal, one that overrides logic to some degree, but given the nature of the subject matter, it's rather an occupational hazard, so to speak. It's a story that nods to the head but appeals to the heart, and most importantly, it's an expression of the power of faith and redemption, all things that are part of the Blatty-involved Exorcist movies in general. No doubt, if you accepted my invitation to make sure that you've seen the movie before watching this video, when you watched it, you'll have been surprised that this film is in this retrospective series at all. But the links are there, not just in the tenuous character cameo link between this and The Exorcist, but most importantly, in the philosophical and religious exploration that the movies are all about. The film is just packed full of details that inform from Cutshaw's sort of premonition that his saviour was coming, to Jason Miller's Lieutenant Reno supplying a kind of literary exposition in his comically crazy production, and even Captain Fairbanks' crazed allusions to what he thinks science should allow him to do, but what reality won't. While there's plenty for me to disagree with in the narrative of the Ninth Configuration, I can't deny its emotional impact. For me, it's a wonderfully presented chance to see from behind the eyes of a believer, and it's done with both passion and humour. The sincerity with which the story is told is enough to get the point over, even if ultimately I come nowhere near to being convinced at the implications, which for me, I tend to accept as part of the story, but can't translate that to the real world. None of that fits for me. The Ninth Configuration is really a largely underappreciated film, and although it's an oddball in the Faith trilogy, it's worth taking the trip out of the horror genre for a far less traumatic and quite uplifting continuation of what The Exorcist was really about.